Yo, what is good? I appreciate everybody for tuning in this Friday night. This is going to be a direct, straight to the point video, one topic. Even though I had some stuff that was fun, we might have to talk about that tomorrow after football. But this is going to be a straight one subject video where we're going to dive into this shooting that occurred involving ICE and a U.S. citizen in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So, as always, I'm Marcus. Here we do attorney reactions to current events, trending news, topics, all of that good stuff. If you find something you like in the channel, definitely invite you to subscribe, support the content. A big salute to everybody who support. Hey, the Bears. Yeah, I think they're gonna win that game. I think the Bears gonna pull that W out tomorrow. Big salute to everybody who support. A special salute and shout out to the channel members. Now, this video is gonna be a little bit different because every now and then I do like an actual, real, legit legal dive. Like, I actually had to take a lot of notes because a lot of things to cover, including one Supreme Court case that we actually had previously talked about on the channel. So we got to do this a certain way because YouTube is kind of goofy. I'm pretty sure everybody has already watched the video, the footage, the cell phone footage from multiple angles. Because shout out to the Bears. Hey, they got one. The Bears are the Bears of this year are the Commanders of last year. Last year, everything went the Commanders' way. Anytime it was a 50-50, it won in favor of the Commanders. That's what's going on with the Bears this year. What's going on, pretty eyes? I appreciate you tuning in. Happy New Year's to you as well. I know everybody say they don't get notifications anymore. I don't know if YouTube is acting up or what the deal is, but I'm glad you were able to tune in. All right. Now, I was gonna pull the video up, but the video is it's just gonna be too much of a pain in the ass. YouTube gonna be like, you can't show this. I'm gonna have to appeal and draft a whole reason why I should be able to show it from the legal analysis standpoint. It's just a pain in the ass. So, for purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that everyone has already saw the video from multiple angles. So we're going to dive in under that assumption. Now, I'm actually going to go through some of these notes. Today, we're going to unpack this controversial law enforcement use of force. It was a fatal shooting of a 37-year-old by the name of Renee Nicole Good by an ICE agent in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're going to explain the laws governing use of force, a major Supreme Court case on deadly force doctrine, and we're going to look at both sides of the debate, whether the shooting was either justified or whether the shooting was excessive. So, again, if you haven't seen the video of what happened, go jump back, watch the video. It's very short. Then get back here so we can talk about it because we're going to talk about a lot of legal nuances. We're going to explain some things. And hey, if y'all got questions, drop them in the chat. I'm going to try to tap in and answer all those questions. All right, so on January 7th, ICE agent Jonathan Ross fatally shot Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old Minneapolis, Minnesota woman who was in her vehicle during a large enforcement operation. Federal sources report that Good was a U.S. citizen, and according to some accounts, may have driven her SUV towards agents after refusing to exit. Minnesota officials and civilian videos suggest she was not a threat and may have been attempting to leave when she was shot. Now, this is interesting because the FBI is actually leading an investigation into this entire use of force situation. And of course, rightfully so, state law enforcement and officials are already criticizing that, as they should. Hey, I'm glad you were able to tune in and actually catch a live. Happy New Year's to everyone as well. Hey, we got to say it today because I feel like this is the last day you can say it. If you say Happy New Year next week, I don't know about me, but I don't want to hear it. So Happy New Year to everybody and glad you could tune in. All right. So we're going to start out with something simple, use of force doctrine. Now, before I talk about the use of force, what makes me knowledgeable about use of force? Well, I've written use of force policy for state, for federal organizations, for local municipalities. And when I say federal organizations, I'm talking about the big boy federal organizations. I'm I'm not gonna say I'm an expert, but I'm gonna say I'm something like an expert in use of force situation and the use of force continuum. So I am experienced in this area. All right. So what is the use of force continuum? The police use of force training generally follows what's a gradual scale from officer presence up through verbal commands to hand control to non-lethal options like an ass baton or pepper spray to lethal force only when necessary to prevent imminent danger or physical harm. Law enforcement agencies, including ICE under DHS, are bound by these use of force policies that permit lethal force only when an officer reasonably believes that there's an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. You know, when we covering use of force situations on this channel, we always talk about, was there a legitimate threat of death or serious bodily harm? Now, the use of force triangle, and I'm going to pull up a classic illustration so you all can just see what it looks like. Now, this is actually kind of an older model. Some newer proponents don't like to use this triangle, but I think that this triangle for use of force gives the best example of what we mean and what this scale is trying to say. So let's go and pull it up on the screen. All right. The use of force continuum pyramid. Essentially, just think of you, law enforcement officers are required to start at the lowest level, the green. So by their physical presence and verbal commands. Hey, can you get out of the vehicle, sir? Can you please stand over there and have a seat on the curb? They try to, typically officers try to give verbal commands to neutralize the scene and isolate threats so that they can deal with whatever the situation is. So you have physical presence. Then after physical presence and verbal commands, it moves up to, okay, if that's not working, we're talking about using hand control. Next up is intermediate weapons, ass batons, OC spray, and then finally deadly force. Now, just for purposes, the reason why a lot of new law enforcement agencies aren't really a fan of this pyramid, because some people see this pyramid and think that law enforcement officers have to gradually start at the bottom and move up to the top. And that's not it. You don't necessarily have to do them in the order. The facts and circumstances can cause you to immediately jump towards hand control, trying to restrain somebody. Or it could immediately, if a person is waving a gun and firing the gun, you aren't going to be like, sir, put the firearm down and stop shooting people. So depending on the situation is where you start on this triangle. It's not necessarily you start at the bottom and you got to go through all of these things. And if none of them work, now you can use deadly force. But that's generally the reason why a lot of law enforcement agencies, as we got into the 2013, 2014-ish, is when people started to say, we don't really like that, because people think it's a sliding scale that you got to start at the bottom and work your way to the top. But we know now that's not the case. Depending on the facts, you jump in directly where you fit in. If someone is rushing towards you as a law enforcement officer and you're standing there, you aren't going to be like, sir, stop rushing towards me, sir, and unball your fist. No, you're going to immediately hands up near your face, defensive position, or position where you can engage the threat. All right. So that's the use of force continuum. We may go back to that, but that's a commonly used triangle graphic to explain force decision making. The decision making, as I said, most modern agencies has moved to alternatives, but this remains familiar. When you looked at that chart, I'm going to pull it up one more time. But the base was communication, warnings, compliance. The middle was control techniques. Then it moved up to intermediate tools, OC spray, ass baton. And then the top was deadly force, guns, which is only justified if there's reasonable threat of death or severe bodily harm. This model helps visualize how officers escalate and de-escalate force through modern doctrines and techniques. You talk about the context. Is the use of force proportional to what was being given towards the officer? And was there another alternative that would have been feasible under the situation? Okay. So now we actually talked about this case before. For y'all who are familiar with the channel, we're going to talk about a Supreme Court case. I actually did a video on this case because it's very rare that this current court decides something unanimously across the board where all 9 justices say, you know what, we agree on that. But we talked about this case, and this case is pertinent because this case involved an officer making a stop. It was a gentleman in his vehicle. The officer was leaning in the window. Shots were actually fired. And now you have this situation of wait. What the question before the court was, what is the time frame that we're looking at to determine if the officer acted reasonable? Because remember, if deadly force is used, the law looks at it from a standard of what would a reasonable officer do in that situation, a reasonable person standard. So just remember that reasonableness standard is always there. So in the Barnes versus Felix case, and after this video, I'll link that case because we actually went through the stop when the guy had his lights off and he popped the trunk, but it was very similar facts. Officer made a stop. It was a black man in the car. The officers interacting. The officers in the car's moving, shots are fired, but it was very specific. The Supreme Court is kind of weird. When they have a case, they're not looking at 5 or 6 issues. They're normally looking at one issue. So what happened in Barnes versus Felix? It was a Texas deputy that shot a motorist who began driving away after a traffic stop. The Fifth Circuit, which is a certain court of appeals, they applied a moment of threat test. What is the moment of threat test? The moment of threat test is a legal standard that says if an officer is involved in a deadly use of force situation, to determine if the officer acted as a reasonable officer would in a similar situation, we are only going to look at the moment the threat occurred. We're not going to look at what happened 10 minutes before. We aren't looking at what happened 6 minutes after. We're going to look at that specific moment in time. And some courts different. Some courts said 5 seconds before the shooting and 5 seconds after. Some courts said 10 seconds before the shooting, 10 seconds after. The bottom line is in that case, Barnes versus Felix that we covered in a previous video that I'll link once I get done with this. The court only looked at the moment of threat. They looked only at whether deadly force was reasonable in that instance. The Supreme Court unanimously rejected the moment of threat rule and confirmed that courts must analyze the totality of the circumstances, including prior events leading up to the shooting, and when the whether use of force was reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. So, long story short, the previous standard was if an officer shoots somebody, we're going to look at that narrow moment in time, maybe a few seconds before the shooting and a few seconds after. I don't even know why that was the rule because that actually makes no fucking sense. I mean, listen, if I have to defend myself, what happens 2 minutes before that instant could provide context up into that instance. So it was a stupid test. The court said, no, we aren't looking at that particular moment a few seconds before and after the shooting. We're going to look at the totality of the circumstances. Now, let me give you an example of why this makes sense. Let's say there was a situation where an officer had a use of force situation and he used deadly force. If you only look at the 5 seconds before the shooting and the 5 seconds after, you want to know what was also important? Well, what if when that officer got the call 6 minutes before he showed up, they actually ran a background check on that person and knew that that person had several gun convictions, an assault on an officer's charge. So that's kind of the logic why you can't look at the specific instance. You got to look at the totality of the circumstances. So the key legal principle here is deadly force is judged by what a reasonable officer on that scene would do in a similar situation. And not only on the split second moment that the shots are fired, but according to the Supreme Court in a decision, the Barnes case that was decided last year, we're going to look at the totality. What happened leading up to the events, before, during, and after. So the legal framework for excessive force in the Fourth Amendment. Under the Fourth Amendment, when the officer sees a person, including by using deadly force, the force must be objectively reasonable given the circumstances. So this is the balancing test. essentially balancing test. Just think of it as two scales. We're going to look at these scales and see, are the scales in favor of the officer, or are they not in favor of the officer? The balancing test includes, one, the severity of the crime that's occurring at the time of the incident, the immediacy of the threat, the officer and public safety concerns, and available alternatives. So when we talk about the severity of the crime, with this situation, I want to make sure, because some people are going to confuse what the severity of the crime, what crime are they looking at? Because you have one side saying that she tried to ram the officer with the car, and the other side saying, no, she wasn't. She was trying to turn to get away. So the severity of the crime that they're looking at is not necessarily what was going on with that vehicle, but we're going to rewind a little bit and look at, why was ICE there in the first place? If law enforcement, if a cop shows up to report somebody, a cop shows up to investigate somebody for loitering or trespassing, that's a factor that's going to go in favor or going to go against the police. Because how did this escalate from you showing up for a trespass or loitering investigation to you ended up shooting somebody? Now it's different if police are reporting to an armed robbery or a carjacking. That would tip the scales into the officer's favor, because the crime that they're reporting to is one where there's an inherent threat of death or severe bodily harm, because guns, firearms are involved. So they're going to look at whether there's a reasonable severity of the crime. Was it a serious crime we were here to look at, or was it some BS? The immediacy of the threat, officer and public safety, and what are their available alternatives? So that's kind of a background. Now, another legal term that you're going to hear quite common is qualified immunity. And I'm not a fan. Qualified immunity is a good and bad thing. I understand why it exists, but oftentimes I think it fucks a lot of people over. So a lot of times officers engage in an act. That act may or may not be wrong, but let's say the officer engages in an act that's wrong. The first thing you heard tossed around is qualified immunity. You're like, damn, well, what is qualified immunity? Qualified immunity shields government officials, including law enforcement officers, from civil liability unless it's clear that they violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right that a reasonable officer should know. That's a very high standard. So officers are immune not from criminal prosecution, but they're immune from civil prosecution unless it showed that they violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right that a reasonable officer should know. What that means to me is violated a clearly established statutory law or right. That's a hard ass burden, because most situations are going to be like what we have before us. It's was she trying to hit him? Was she trying to leave? How did the officer perceive it? Because I mean, let's look at it from one side. If you're standing in front of a vehicle and I'm trying to turn and I turn my wheels so my wheels aren't facing you and I'm trying to leave, how do you perceive that if I'm in a big ass Escalade or a Tahoe? I'm just asking. It depends on the officer's training, depends on the level of threat at the time. It depends on a lot of factors. Okay. So qualified immunity does apply to federal officers, including ICE, in suits alleging constitutional violations. And for qualified immunity, the court is essentially going to ask a few questions. One, was there a constitutional violation? And two, was that right clearly established at the time of conduct? If the answer is either is no, the officer is going to be immune from civil liability. So now let's get down to the arguments, because there were a couple of things in this video that I think both sides did wrong. Okay. This is my general rule of thumb. My son have been in the vehicle with me when I got pulled over for some bullshit, and I'm probably a little bit more of a douchebag than I would recommend anyone else be. But that's partly because my profession, partly because I'm known in the community, just in the courthouse. So it's a little bit different. The advice I give my son, and I would give anybody, is when you're stopped by law enforcement officers, your sole job is to get wherever it is you're going, whether it's home, whether they lock you up, to get there in one physical piece, and you save the fight for the courtroom and for the lawyers. Make sure you get where you're going in one piece. So the first thing that I identified that was incorrect or shouldn't have been done from the role of the decedent, the woman who was shot by ICE. Again, and I'm not judging her. I'm gonna talk about what ICE did wrong as well. Is when you're stopped by law enforcement, especially federal law enforcement, is different. It's different. I don't think if that was a situation where it was a local sheriff, a white woman in a car, it's probably not going to result in gunshots. I'm just Minnesota, probably not going to result in gunshots. But when you should always comply with officers. Like I said, you want to get home or get to wherever you're going in one piece uh, without any injuries. But when you're dealing with federal law enforcement officers, I think it's actually elevated. Well, why is it elevated? Shouldn't it be the same for every officer? Let's talk about this a little bit different. Local law enforcement is more used to having interactions with civilians. And what I mean by that is in general, everyday encounters where people are generally just passerbys. Federal law enforcement is a little bit different. Federal law enforcement, to include Department of Homeland Security, DEA, FBI, all of these federal alphabet soup agencies that are out there, they have way less encounters with the general public in everyday interactions. That's one. Two, they tend to operate and work in more, I'm not going to say more high stressful environments, because local law enforcement have stressful situations too, but DEA, FBI, they're often engaged in a lot of undercover operations and things of that nature, which makes the stress level, I think, a little bit more elevated. Me being a combat vet, I've never been a law enforcement officer, but I've been in a war zone. I've been shot at before. I've done dirty work. When the stress level is elevated, everybody is on edge more. And I think it's more likely that a situation is going to elevate the stress level of a federal law enforcement officer just by the nature of their work, more so than a state or local law enforcement officer. So, one, when she was in her vehicle sideways in the middle of the street, it would have behooved her to just put the shit in park. Just put it in park. Do not try to back up to get out the way. You backed up, you were out of the way, traffic was able to move. I mean, I wish I could rewind back and pop up on her shoulder, and I would have been like, please, lady, put the vehicle in park and keep your hands on the steering wheel. That would have been advice. So I think that was something that could have. I mean, and ICE always, they always going in overly aggressive. Let's just keep it a buck. But I think if the vehicle is stationary, is actually parked and her hands on the wheel, is a much higher likelihood that this isn't escalating. And ultimately, it was the movement of the vehicle, no matter which way you want to call it, that kind of facilitated this entire situation. But for the movement of the vehicle, if the vehicle never moves, we probably don't even get here. So that was a mistake or error that I wish could have been changed on the part of the decedent. Now, let's pivot and talk about ICE, because again, I'm not going to play the video because YouTube is funky. But when we're looking at what ICE did, there are certain fundamental principles that most law enforcement officers should know by going to their local or state law enforcement academy. Some federal officers go to FLETC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy. Wherever you go, one thing that was done that was completely ridiculous was the officer actually putting himself in harm's way, standing in front of the vehicle. Where do you do that at? I've been to training facilities for federal agents, for local law enforcement. It's a general rule. I've actually seen this taught where you Try to avoid putting yourself in harm's way. You should never stand your physical body in front of a vehicle because it makes you susceptible to getting ran the fuck over, either by mistake or on purpose. So I think the ICE agents use some poor tactics and piss poor training because one officer was at the driver's side door. I'm not worried about him. The other officer was standing right in front of the vehicle, around kind of between the middle of the vehicle and where the driver's side headlight is. He is completely assed out. Even if the lady isn't trying to run him over, if she slips, her foot slips off the pedal. If the officer who's at the door reaches in and grabs her and she reacts and let her foot off the gas, he getting ran the fuck over, or potentially could get ran the fuck over. So there was some mistakes on both sides as to how this entire thing played out. Now, we're going to talk about the arguments on both sides, because what it's going to boil down to is, well, one, whether qualified immunity is going to apply. But what it's going to boil down to is the ultimate question of, do people think she was in the vehicle trying to actually hit this guy? And if that is the case, it's going to support the narrative that, hey, it was a deadly threat. The vehicle was being used as an instrument to cause a fatality. I have a right to defend myself, and I defended myself to remove the threat. If it's perceived that the vehicle wasn't being used as a weapon, but she was merely trying to escape, then the pendulum is going to swing definitely against the officers trying to make that argument. So arguments on both sides. Too much force, excessive. Civil rights experts argue that the video shows Good's SUV was not actively threatening the life when the shots were fired. Again, this language, I even had to say this, possibly turning away rather than advancing. Critics say firing at the moving vehicle near civilians should be the last resort, as protocols discourage shooting at cars unless extreme danger is clear. Now, I don't know. I'm just reading what the arguments are, what I wrote for the arguments. I already see the flaws in what these arguments are, and I fucking wrote them. Opponents of the federal narrative are arguing that DHS rhetoric calling the act domestic terrorism lacked independent evidence. I completely agree with that 100%. But the other two are a little flimsy. I'm just going to be honest. Hey, I appreciate it. What's going on, Maui? I appreciate you tuning in, sis. But the first two arguments, I want to break these down real quick. Civil rights experts argue the video showed Good's SUV was not actively threatening the life when shots were fired, possibly turning away rather than advancing. Remember when we previously talked about what the standard officer is going to be judged on? It's a objectively reasonable standard. What a reasonable officer would think. In that situation, if you were the officer, they're not asking what she thought or what the people in the car thought. It's from the perspective of what the officer thought. So if you're standing in front of that vehicle, her wheels are turned, and they're turned at an angle where she could possibly be trying to turn to avoid the situation and not hit you, what would you perceive in that moment, in that high stress moment as an officer? What would you think? Would you think, man, she's trying to hit me with this damn car? Or would you think she was trying to turn out the way? And also, we got to remember, we're looking at it in hindsight. We're playing Monday morning quarterback. We're not in the situation as it happening in real life, in real time. It just kind of elevates the thing. And the other bullet, critics say firing a moving vehicle near a civilian should be the last resort, and the protocols discourage shooting at cars. That is true. But it discourages shooting at cars, vehicles, unless there's extreme danger and that danger is clear. How are they going to determine if the danger is clear? By looking at what a reasonable officer would do in that similar situation. What was the officer's perspective? Did he fear for his life? So just the standard alone makes it a little bit challenging, and it kind of leans in the officer's favor. Now, the arguments that is reasonable self-defense, federal officials, including DHS leadership, claim that ICE agents face attempted vehicular assault and an imminent threat justifying the use of deadly force under policy. And we're going to talk about what DHS's policy say. Agents' experience with prior vehicle-related injury is cited as a context reinforcing his perception of danger. A lot of times when we go through and we looked at complaints and sworn affidavits submitting to the court as evidence to justify arrest or probable cause for a warrant, when we always read those things, they always start out talking about the officer's experience. I, Officer John Smith, have been an officer on the force for 25 years. I received my initial training at the Federal Law Enforcement Officer Training Center, Flexi, in 1999. Immediately after that, I started, like, they always lean on that narrative before they give the facts because they have to tie in their experience. So if this officer has, I've been in previous situations where vehicles were used, and in those situations, we have a split second to react. We don't even have a second to react. But that's why they always talk about, that's why those affidavits and those probable cause affidavits always start out with the experience, because the officer is going to lean on that. Because remember, it's from a reasonable officer standard. If a reasonable officer in the same situation believed there was life-threatening risk, the Fourth Amendment would allow lethal force. I mean, law enforcement is a brotherhood. Say what you want to say, is a brotherhood, is a gang, a crew, a mob, a conglomerate, if you will. Call it what you want. But before this officer, there's three perspectives of what happened. Anytime I had an investigation, and I've had investigations where I actually investigated armed federal agents. There's what actually happened. There's what actually happened. Then there's what the agent can recall. And then there's what the agent can recall after he saw his body worn camera footage. Those are always three different things. If some crazy shit happened, that's why before the agent go in there and talk to whoever their rep is, they actually want to get like, hey, let's see the body cam footage. Because nobody wants to, you already know, if I talk to you immediately after something happened, and then you watch the footage of that event, now you're like, oh yeah, I do remember. You don't remember shit. You saw the footage. And so there's always three different versions of what happened. Now, how is this likely to play out in court? This is the really big question. Prosecutors will have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the agent's use of force was unreasonable and unjustified. That's a very high bar, especially given legal protections and federal policies on officers' self-defense. Very high bar. And I even think that qualified immunity, I don't know if we have enough facts as they are now to remove the protection of qualified immunity. Remember, with qualified immunity, the court is looking at, was there a constitutional violation, and was that right clearly established at the time of conduct? The key word is clearly established, not possibly established, reasonably. Was it clearly established? So, okay, back to the predictions. All right. So I don't think anything is going to come from this federally from a criminal standpoint. I don't think the DOJ would have any interest under this current regime in prosecuting this. JD Vance already came out talking about qualified immunity, and the standard for qualified immunity is a high standard to get over in order to, go after a federal officer civilly. Criminally, I just don't think it's going to happen. All right. Now, civilly, a civil lawsuit would come under 14 USC 1983. In order for there to be civil liability, the plaintiff must show that the officer violated a clearly established constitutional right. According to the case we talked about, Barnes versus Felix, this means the court is going to look at all factors, including what happened before the shooting. They're not just going to look at that narrow moment in time. But qualified immunity may protect the agent unless there's clear precedent stating that this exact scenario was unlawful. The prediction, which is kind of a neutral take, court historically give law enforcement officers wide latitude in a split-second decision. Unless video evidence strongly undermines the claim imminent threat, it is more likely that a civil suit may be dismissed based on qualified immunity ground, though that's not a guarantee. Now, I I think there was multiple failures on both sides. It was even one time in the video after the woman was shot where there was a doctor on the scene and they're like, yo, I'm a doctor, I can help. And ICE was like, hell no, stay the hell back there. And I think that officers inherently have a duty to try to preserve life. Even if it's the life of a bad guy, that's a duty that officers have. But that's kind of split because I've seen some people say, well, the officers had that was egregious on the officers to decline that help. But when shots are fired, generally the first thing you want to do is make sure the area is secure before you start rendering help. Why is that? I know it's very likely in this scenario, but once shots are fired, you don't know who else may or may not have a firearm. You don't know who may escalate something in the crowd. But there was a lot of mistakes made from both sides. This is tragic. And this kind of highlights how constitutional standards, policy, and split second decisions just collide in real life. Understanding the Barnes versus Felix case, where they're looking at not just that little moment before and after the shooting occurred, when they're looking at the totality, and the Fourth Amendment's reasonable officer text, it gives context to how both defenders and critics of this situation are going to look at it. What is my opinion? I think that the officers went too far personally. Why do I think the officers went too far? Because during the course of the interaction, I don't know if there was anything or any facts there. Now we don't know about who they were there to initially apprehend, and I don't know at this moment what the background of that person was. That person could have been a damn cartel hitman, or that person could have been someone who was a florist and had a small business. We don't know, but just as the facts as they have them now, I think that the officers went too far considering what we have with regard to the woman who was in the vehicle. But with that being said, even though the officers, in my opinion, I think they went too far in their actions, I don't know if the facts are enough to overcome that the officer wasn't acting in a reasonable manner. I can see it both ways. And normally if you can see it both ways, it's going to lend in the officer's favor. The officer's probably going to get the benefit of the doubt. So even though I think they went too far, I would be shocked if anything happens to these officers from a criminal standpoint or a civil standpoint. When we talk about DHS's policy, I meant to talk about that. DHS does have a policy when it comes to shooting in vehicles, and it's exactly what we thought it would be. It's we generally frown upon shooting inside of vehicles. Why? I mean, just common sense. When you shoot inside of a vehicle and you hit somebody, you create a public safety hazard for civilians and law enforcement officers, but they have that carve out unless the officer is in immediate apprehension and fear of death or severe bodily harm. The fact that I could see it going both ways, because when I first watched the video, I didn't listen to the audio, so I didn't know. I just watched the video with no audio, and I was like, wait, did the vehicle move before or after the shots? Because that's going to be important. If the vehicle moved and then the shot happened, the officers are going to have a lot of deference because of the immediacy of it. If you look at the seconds that lapse between that, you're talking about a split second, less than a damn second. So you got very limited reaction time. So that's how I think this is going to play out. It is what it is. Now, with qualified immunity, I do have a thought on qualified immunity. I understand why we have it, but what I think should happen with qualified immunity is we want to create a system where law enforcement is encouraged to act in a manner that's consistent with acting in good faith. We want our officers to act in good faith, and not blatantly violate the law. So what I think should happen is, if qualified immunity is breached, so let's say these officers' conduct was found to be egregious and everybody was like, no, she clearly was making a turn. It wasn't trying to ram you. If officers lose qualified immunity and now they actually are subject to civil liability, the money for those civil judgments should be one that comes directly out of an officer's pension fund. Well, how and why do you think that would help? Well, okay, let's say the officer loses qualified immunity and he sues civilly and he loses. The officer technically doesn't lose anything because the taxpayers are the one who is going to pay out that judgment. The insurance is probably going to, the government has insurance, the insurance is going to do the payout. The government is going to pay the premium of the insurance. And because they just lost that case, that premium is going to go up. And when the government pays insurance, everybody say, oh, taxpayers. I've seen politicians use this argument. Taxpayers aren't on the hook because the insurance pay it. Well, if the government has insurance, how the hell you think the government is paying the insurance off with taxpayer money? So I think that there's some benefit if qualified immunity doesn't apply because the officer had some obvious, clear wrongdoing that violated a constitutional right. The recoupment of those funds shouldn't necessarily fall on the burden of the taxpayers. I think that officer pension fund should take a hit. Either way, it's the taxpayer, because I mean, we pay officers, we pay law enforcement, but I think that would give some incentive. If I'm an officer and I acted in bad faith and I lost, and a judgment was paid out, but it doesn't impact me directly, what is the harm that I have no incentive to actually try to spin around and do the right thing? That's just my thought on qualified immunity. Okay. Doesn't it matter that she should not have tried to drive away? We are encouraging people to run from police. Like, come on. I could completely agree. That was the very first thing I said was she should not have moved her vehicle. She should not move her vehicle because once you move that vehicle, it's just problems. Like, I can't in my mind rationalize the officers. The officers, I think, escalated the situation, but I think that their argument for an immediate threat is a viable argument. That's why I said I could see it both ways. If I'm sitting on a jury, I'm not going to say, nah, her wheels was all the way. She had her steering wheel locked to the right. So because of that, she was trying to avoid him. You know how many people probably get hit by a fucking car with the steering wheel locked to the damn right? If I'm standing in front of a car and the wheel is locked all the way to the right, I don't give a flying fuck where the wheel is at. If I'm standing in front of the car and you move, I'm assuming you trying to hit my black ass. That's just me. So I think your point is a fair point. That's why I said I think that this could go both ways. I think that she should not have, she should have put her shit in park and put her hands on the steering wheel. And I think the officer standing in front of the vehicle needs some type of remedial training, because training 101 is you don't put yourself in a dangerous situation. He should have never been standing in front of that vehicle to begin with, because that's an actual dangerous situation. But I do agree with your point. I think that the fact that the vehicle moved, a moving vehicle with I'm in front of it, is a threat to my life. Let's just be realistic. Is a moving vehicle, if you're standing directly in front of it, less than 1 inch in front of it, his damn body could touch it. Is a moving vehicle that you're standing directly in front of a threat to your life? I don't give a damn with no distance in between you. Do it really make a difference which way the wheel is turning? If it's turning to the left, to the right? I mean, let's just be logical here. That's why I think that the facts are, I think that the officers could have done some efforts to avoid this situation, as well as the driver of the vehicle. And I think the onus to do things to avoid this situation is actually on the civilian, not law enforcement. Because you already know law enforcement, sometimes they're going to be a little trigger happy. Sometimes they're going to be overzealous. You don't know the person they were actually there for, which probably wasn't her. You don't know what background information they got on that person that could elevate the risk of that situation. All of that shit is a factor. So I think the officers went a little too far, but I think both sides fucked up. But I think the facts as we have them right now, they aren't going to have enough facts to say that these officers can be sued civilly. I don't think they can get over the qualified immunity hurdle. I don't think you can convince 12 people that these officers actually murdered this woman. I just don't see that happening. Even if I'm sitting on the jury, I'm like, they murdered her, or was he actually in fear of his life? I don't know. I mean, it's fucked up, but it is what it is. I'm gonna call it down the middle. I'm gonna call it down the middle. Let's see. Yeah, I don't disagree. I've actually been that close to a car in downtown DC, seen people like getting ready to go home, and they're standing on the curb, and they kind of just off the curb, and cars go by so close they ran over a motherfucker feet, crushed his damn toe, and that car kept going. When you're in close proximity to a vehicle, the where the wheel is turned, if you're in front of it, like would that okay, would the scenario change? Let's just say hypothetically, because what happened was, let's say hypothetically, because there's going to be people out there who are like, oh man, you always pro law enforcement, but I'm just telling you objectively, they're not going to have enough evidence to get over any of these hurdles. But let's just say hypothetically, the same situation happened. The officer is in front of the vehicle, her wheel is all the way locked to the right, as it was. Now, in this situation, when she took off, the officer took a jump to his right, I left when we're watching it. Let's say that officer reflexes wasn't enough and he got hit by that vehicle, and then his partner shot in the car. Let's change the hypothetical. If the officer would have got hit by the vehicle, would that have changed your analysis? Like, it's kind of like, you all remember when I did the video about the three fifth grade girls who plotted a murder plot on another fifth grader. And we were having an argument over if they should be charged as adults. And some people were like, nah, they shouldn't be charged with adults. But these fifth graders in this scenario, they planned this murder. They went and got gloves. They had a plan for a knife and how they were going to lure her out to the bathroom outside during recess. They actually started taking steps to write a suicide note to make it look like a suicide. But there were actually people who were like, now these are fifth graders or sixth graders. In any event, that's crazy. But my rule is, when you do big boy shit, you get big boy punishments, no matter what it is, unless you're like 2 or something. But they planned all this out, and people were like, I said, me personally, if they were charged as adults, I wouldn't be concerned. And everybody's like, nah, but they're minors. They don't know the consequences of their actions. And I said, well, let's say they actually would have went through with it, and those 3 girls would have killed that fifth grade boy. Would your analysis change? Your analysis shouldn't change on whether the purported person survived or not survived. The analysis should just be based on the facts. I mean, if you're going to call it down the middle, that's my thought. I just think that there's not enough evidence there. I don't think the speed with which all of this happened, the distance that the officer was from the front of the vehicle, the stress of the situation. I just think that argument that I was in imminent fear of being hit by a fucking car is going to be a justifiable argument that you aren't going to be able to convince 12 people that no, she was really trying to escape. You just aren't. Yeah, I tell people that all the time. It's your job to get home safely. Me, I probably would have had a problem because I'm just going to talk shit by default, but that's different. Everybody isn't equipped with what actually they should say to law enforcement officers. You can say the right shit to some law enforcement officers, and they actually legit be like, wait a minute, who the fuck is this guy? He knows some shit. Did he know somebody? But most people don't have that advantage. Most people should not do that. You should just comply and make sure you get the fuck home. The officer should be subjected to some consequences if he wasn't following protocol. I agree with that. I don't know if you're going to get someone. I don't know. I just think that he's going to have the support from I refer to them as the boys in blue. That's just kind of what it is. But I do think definitely some remedial training is. If you going out standing in front of a vehicle, that's actually dumb. you're putting yourself in a prime situation where, and honestly, really, the best thing that could have happened is somebody walk behind the vehicle and get the license plates of the vehicle. If she would have taken off, y'all got all these ICE vehicles there. Where if you wanted to try to follow her or subsequently do something, there could have been something that was done smarter on all sides. But at the end of the day, it's fucked up. I think that I think there are a lot of situations where ICE is going too far in their use of force. But I also think there are a lot of situations where, like, come on now, the onus is on you as the civilian to put yourself in a situation where you can make it home. If the question is, I'm a wild out and pray to God that this officer doesn't wild out and shoot my ass, the answer is I'm not going to wild out because I don't want this officer to shoot my ass. I've had clients who I represented when I was doing defense work who had, I had one guy, he actually got picked up by ICE in the courtroom. Actually, as he was leaving, he was my client. We had a case. I can't remember what it was. Maybe it was an assault or some shit. It wasn't nothing like gunplay or nothing like that or drugs. It may have been an assault of a, I don't know, like a person who he resided with, like another male he resided with or some shit like that. But the guy got picked up. We got a continuance because I needed to meet with the guy. He gets picked up by ICE. He didn't act wild. Now I know this is a different time, but he did it the right way. When he got picked up by ICE, ICE picks up people coming out of the courthouse all the time. You know how many clients I've had, and I'd be like, just FYI, you got some federal shit going on here, bro, and we in state court, and I can't guarantee that you're gonna get to your parking lot, to your car in the parking lot without getting picked up on this federal warrant. Oh, we just got these state charges dismissed, but the feds picked them up. So you may not make it that far once you get out of the courthouse. But when my client got picked up by ICE, I made some calls, was able to actually get him out of ICE custody. After he got out of ICE custody, we subsequently went to court. He was actually found not guilty. Now, again, I know this is a different climate, but if the options are, I'm going to fight my battle in court, or I'm going to try to fight my battle right here on the sidewalk, on the pavement, and pray that I don't get shot, I'm going with the option that won't get me fucking shot. That's what I would advise anyone to do. Okay, now the officer, good question. Did the officers give the woman any directions? If so, were those directions clear? Shouldn't there be consequences for blocking medical aid? ICE isn't innocent. Again, I don't think they're innocent, but okay, ICE did give commands. They gave a command to actually get out of the vehicle. And that's another factor we're going to look at. Remember, we're looking at the totality according to the Supreme Court case. Was a verbal command given? Yes. So actually, technically, let's just be realistic. Let's keep it a buck here. If we know that a verbal command was given, which it was, you could honestly say that, like, hey, if we're looking at this diagram, they went through two of these things. And remember, it's not a progression. You jump in as law enforcement where you think the appropriate force is needed to eliminate the threat. So I would actually go as far to say that's a great question, because this is a great way we can look at this use of force continuum. I would go to far as say, was there presence and verbal command? Yes. Empty hand control. Well, what was the empty hand control? Before the vehicle took off, if I recall the video properly, it looked like the officer he gave the verbal command. Now, remember, there is an argument that, hey, if you give a verbal command, you got to have some time to actually respond to the verbal command. But the shit is moving like this. He did give a verbal command. Was there any empty hand type of things? At some point, the officer by the driver's door is reaching in the vehicle. When he's reaching in the vehicle, I would love to hear his perspective of what he was trying to do. Was he trying to throw? Because again, the vehicle isn't moving, but we could clearly ascertain that the vehicle is in drive. So her foot is probably on the brake. Was he reaching in? Was it a gear shift near the steering wheel? Was he reaching in trying to throw it in park? Was he reaching in trying to snatch her hands off the steering wheel? All of that is relevant, but there was presence, there was verbal control. I would say there was empty-handed control. There was no impact weapons or chemical agents. It jumped straight to deadly force. But all of this shit happened in a matter of like maybe a second. But that was a really good question because we could go back and look at this use of force continuum. But yes. Now, will there be a sanction for blocking medical aid? Probably not, because okay, let's take this out from this situation, because everybody is going to get all political with it and sensitive and shit when we got to look at it objectively. That's what I want everybody to do on this channel: look at it objectively, and see what both sides are going to argue. Then you make your decision based on the facts. But let's say people were trying to jack me as I was leaving my vehicle coming from a movie theater, and I'm a concealed carrier, as we already know if you watch this channel, and it's two persons, and there's a third person in the car, and I feel threatened. The person comes up to me and they got their hand like this: "Yo, give me all of your stuff. Give me all of your stuff." I'm gonna be honest. If somebody come up to me like that, I'm assuming what you got is a gun, and you might get smoked. Let's just be real. But law enforcement officers are taught the same way. If you go as a civilian to a training, it says everybody everybody gets seconds before anyone gets help. So what that means is, if I'm a law enforcement officer and there's just been a use of force situation, immediately after the situation, you hear the comment of the doctor, and the officers are like, "No, get away." Whether or not medical aid was declined is going to be kind of a toss up, because once you have a use of force situation, the first thing that you want to do is just make sure the area is secure. Because if the area isn't secure, I'm just using a hypothetical, even though it didn't happen here, but you can have a situation where an officer uses a use of force and they say, "Hey, I'm a doctor." And they're like, "Okay, come on over here and help." But they don't have anything secure, and the crowd get out of control. A riot starts. Maybe there's another shooter that occurs. I'm not saying all those things happen, but there is some validity to, okay, we just had to use deadly force. I know this guy can help, but let's kind of secure the scene. Damn, let's kind of secure the scene and get things stable so there's no other threats before we can get help. So that's kind of going to depend on what the scene was, and it's really going to depend on what the officers say. What the officers say is going to be paramount, because we can't get the officer's objective view of reasonableness until he sits down and explain what was happening. And of course, by the time he sit down and explain what was happening, he probably going to talk to 16 people about what the fuck happened. So unfortunately, again, I think that I'm not even going to call her a victim in this situation. Well, she was a victim, but I think the decedent made some mistakes that contribute to this. I think ICE made some mistakes that contributed to this. I don't think there's going to be any criminal culpability, because I just don't see any way you can get 12 people in a box. Because the question is going to be, was the officer engaging in self-defense, or was it a murder? That's the question. Was the officer in reasonable fear of immediate severe bodily harm or death? You're not going to get 12 people who are going to say, "Nah, he wasn't an immediate threat of death, even though he was standing in front of a car, and even though the wheels were turned to the right." You might get 6 who will say that. You might get 5, but you're not going to get 12 people who are going to say that. So I just don't think DOJ is going to pursue it. Civilly, I don't think they have enough to get over the qualified immunity. So at the end of the day, I'm gonna be honest, I think these officers are going to walk away unscathed from this situation. It's going to be interesting to see how the politicians in Minnesota react. They're already losing their shit, but unfortunately, I think this is just a situation that the number one thing is civilians need to The onus is on you to make sure you conduct yourself in a manner that's going to result in you not getting a hot one in your ass. You can't expect the officers to. I'm not anticipating on no fucking officer to use any level of reasonableness. Again, and I'm not saying that how she reacted wasn't fair under the situation because she probably was scared as fuck. I remember getting stopped by cops when I was maybe like 13 or 14, and I think it was like 13, and we were walking in a parking lot in a shopping center, and I'm walking with my brother. We, long ass hair, afros. We look like before YNs were YNs, you know what I mean? And I remember these cops just stopped and were like, literally just stopped and hopped out and was like, oh, y'all know anything about a murder? And of course, my brother being my brother, he said some smart shit. But like in that situation, I was young. I really didn't know how to react. Like I was scared. I was moving, I was fidgety because I just didn't know how to react. So I'm not saying that how she reacted wasn't fair under the circumstances, but it wasn't the best way to react. Put your shit in park, hands on the steering wheel, keep your eyes forward. If they ask to see ID, okay, my ID is in my right pocket and I need to go in my right pocket. Is it okay if I remove my right hand from the steering wheel and go into my right pocket while my left hand remains on the steering wheel? You can have your partner come over and we can open the passenger door so he can see as I go into my right pocket. It sounds crazy that you have to be that specific, but I would be in this climate. Yo, y'all let me know what y'all think. Y'all think I'm working for the feds, or y'all think I just don't think it's gonna be enough here. Like, yo, you shouldn't have moved the fucking car. Point blank, period. Officer shouldn't have been in the front, but even if that officer was on the side, I'm still going back to it. If the officer was on the side, you still shouldn't have moved the fucking car. Again, I'm not trying to blame, but everybody could have done things a little bit different here. That's my take. You all let me know what y'all think in the comments. Tomorrow, I keep hitting this damn microphone. It's actually like longer than my previous microphone. Tomorrow, I got a few videos I want to talk about. We're going to talk about the Detroit bus situation where there was some work cheek clapping going on, and that was about to result in a bunch of people losing their job. And I'll be honest, if I'm at work and I walk in on people having a cheek clapping session, nobody will ever know about it. I'm not telling them. I'm not telling nobody. I'm gonna just mind my business and keep going. But we're gonna look into that. We're gonna look into what happened with Judge Elaine Dugan, who was actually convicted for trying to help illegal migrant avoid ICE detection. And even though she was found guilty, she's actually still getting paid, still getting her judge salary, and taxpayers are still paying her salary, which is crazy work. But we're gonna dive into those videos and a lot more tomorrow. It's gonna be late because your boy gonna watch some football first. Go Bears! Go! Best of luck to everybody. I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm just an observer, and I want to see a good game. Y'all have a good one. Y'all be blessed. I'm appreciative of everybody who tuned in. Make sure y'all hit the bell notification because a lot of people saying they aren't getting these videos. We'll get at it tomorrow. Y'all be safe. Have a good night. Peace. Mm-hmm.